Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, hosted by Future Framed TV. I'm here with Rachel Lowry from the WWF. Rachel, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Before I jump in with my first question, what is normal? Can I ask you what perspectives and experiences do you bring to this question?
Well, I suppose I've had a 20-year career based on environmental conservation. So when you ask me about normal, I'm going to always draw on an environmental lens because that's the frame of mind that I've been in for 2 decades now. In my time at WWF, I have been across a number of campaigns from ranging from food security related issues through to wildlife conservation. But Paul, I think you and I first touched base back when I was working in the zoo-based industry, still also in conservation, but looking at how we can secure threatened species, breed them up, release them, and ensure that they thrive out there in the wild. So in regards to my professional lens, conservation's certainly going to be the lens that I bring. But I suppose also as a working mother in a time of abnormality, which is 2020, I'll make no apologies for no doubt using that lens as well.
So, a mother, conservationist, environmentalist, how does a person with all these perspectives and experiences answer the question, what is normal?
Well, that's a good one. When you talked to me about normal originally, I thought I'm not going to look up an actual dictionary definition of normal because you had assured me that everyone brings their own view and lens to normal. So when I reflected on the word normal, I suppose I thought about it in regards to what can we rely on? You know, based on prior trends or habitual behaviors, what could we rely on with confidence is going to happen next, tomorrow, the next day, and onwards? To me, you start to move into a rhythm of normality when you feel as though there is a trend as such that gives you a sense of next steps. So, to me, I suppose, interestingly, normal is something that conservationists work to disrupt because normal is not getting us to where we want to be in regards to securing a sustainable future.
I love that. Normal is something you want to disrupt. Normal is about our expectations. It's about where to next. And as a conservationist, as an environmentalist, it's really important to disrupt that because where we're going to next planetarily, if that's a word, is not great.
Certainly not from an environmental perspective. And so that's the thing, I suppose, when normal is on trend and creating something good and positive for the world, like so many of the humanitarian based trends are, we're seeing poverty rates reduce, actually. We're seeing child mortality rates reduce. When we're seeing more and more girls receive education. So that's a normal trend. If I was to think about what's going to happen in another 5 years and I cross my fingers and hope to rely on the normal we're currently experiencing, I would say it's good. From an environmental standpoint, though, we risk losing a great deal if we continue to allow normal to prevail.
So, how do you go about disrupting normality?
I think first of all, it's just recognizing that you need to. That's going to be the first step, right? Because when you look at your vision of success or your ideal state that you want us to all work towards, for me, if I look at it purely from an Australian context, I want to know that my children and my children's children and so on have access to clean water, have good air quality, are able to enjoy and experience Australia's rich wildlife.
Mm.
And so to me, you've got to have a vision of success first, and then you need to work through, is your current normal going to get you there? If you look around and you may win some battles, so to speak, but are you winning the war overall in kind of trying to create the impact that you're after? And certainly a lot of the trajectories at the moment are saying, we do need to disrupt normal. We need to start doing things differently. So how do we disrupt? I think it's about reaching out to minds that aren't used to applying themselves to problem solving through an environmental lens. Because
Mm.
I tend to think if environmentalists on our own were going to get the job done, we'd have us on a different normal trajectory now, wouldn't we? And so we're trying and we've made cases and we argue and we need to keep advocating and we need to keep relying on the science. But there's so many indicators at the moment to tell us that it's not normal at the moment. to heed the science.
It sounds like we need a constructive feedback loop to double check what our patterns of behavior, the flux of our patterns of behavior are doing, and whether that matches. I love that the image and the goals that we want for our next generation.
I think so. And this word innovation, what does it mean to us? Because I suppose innovation is all about busting us out of normal cycles, right? That's
Right.
the idea of innovation. And so who are the people that we can rely on who are just genuine innovators that think differently, that look at something from a different perspective, that ideate and validate and test and hypothesize and don't allow themselves to get into a cycle of normal because they're always keen to naturally disrupt. I think the environmental sector need to reach out to those types of minds a lot more than we currently do.
What are some of the challenges to disrupting normality?
Well, it depends, I suppose, on the impact that you're trying to create and why you want to disrupt normality. Because there can be a number of challenges. One can be habitual behavior. So if we're looking at societal norms, habits are hard to break, right?
Right.
And so we've learnt from conservation psychology that awareness on its own does not shift people out of cycles that could be disruptive. People
Mm.
might say, yeah, I care about that, I'm interested in that, but they go home and we still take the comfortable, cheaper, habitual route sometimes. So that's hard. There are other barriers like policy or legislation. When something has been legislated, it locks us into a normal. It sets a standard, and that becomes our normality, our reality. It's one of the reasons why you see so many environmental organisations focusing on policy and legislation change, because we're actually trying to normalise the good patterns and disrupt the bad patterns.
So awareness is not enough. And at a policy legislation level, there seems to be a lot of action to change or attempt to change the standards that we accept as normal everyday life. What are some of the efforts that you may have been involved in?
Well, right now, you'll see pretty much the majority of the environment sector in Australia focusing on a once in a decade opportunity to influence Australia's nature laws.
Great.
Because our EPBC, Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, basically sets a standard of normal. It says to Australia, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And it is the federal mechanism within Australia to prevent habitat destruction. So, we need to have a look at, has that attempt to lock in a positive normal been working for Australia? And unfortunately, it hasn't. It's been active for 20 years. It gets reviewed every 10 years. And land clearing, in excess of the size of Tasmania has occurred over that period in mainland Australia on top of threatened species habitat. So that's not the normal that act was trying to secure, which
Mm.
means as you go through a review period, you want to disrupt that normal. We want to say, hang on a second, we can't lose the size of Tasmania in habitat for threatened species again. And so that's a big piece of work at the moment that we're working on, which is the EPBC review.
So in effect, habitat destruction has been the normal as a consequence of.
Yeah, it has. And the idea of the legislation is that once an animal becomes threatened, we list it as threatened and it gets EPBC protection. But that hasn't been working, so we have to test, because there was an assumption that would become our reality. But the koala was listed as vulnerable in 2012, and we've accelerated the destruction of its habitat since 2012. The same thing happened when we listed the greater glider. So as soon as that was listed and received EPBC protection, habitat destruction increased rather than decreased. And so we have to make sure that the norms that are set by legislation are actually working. And I think at the moment it's probably the most significant opportunity for the environment if we can get these laws right.
I think that's a point really worth expanding and unpacking. And I don't want to make any assumptions. How did habitat destruction increase after these animals were listed as vulnerable or endangered?
Because the trajectory for land clearing was increasing anyway. So basically, listing them didn't trigger the increase. Listing them just didn't prevent it or turn it around.
Okay.
So we have an increase in population, which means we're all eating more. And the major driver for habitat destruction for koalas is clearing land for beef, particularly across Queensland and New South Wales, which is why we see the koala across Eastern Australia endangered. So we basically failed to shift that trajectory around despite the fact that that species was listed, what we saw happen was agriculturalists and pastoralists just continue with the normal approach to farming, and the EPBC Act failed to regulate. So they were actually in breach of the law, that what's been happening has been illegal, but we have normalised and accepted, I suppose, the fact that farming practices can do that, and we failed to regulate, which is one of the reasons why at the moment the new normal we're trying to bring in is an independent compliance body, a regulator, so that we can lock in over the next 10 years a different reality.
So that regulator has not been in place until now, or
We haven't got one.
yeah, at
We haven't
all.
got
Yeah,
one, yeah, at all. So you'd struggle to find, it's not normal to not have an independent regulator. Most federal acts that are governed by a Commonwealth will have one. We have one to oversee the laws that govern our police force nationally, for example. But we don't for the environment. What we have for the environment is this little loophole in our laws, which has created a normal that we've got to disrupt, which says ministers can have ministerial discretion. And so what we end up finding is decisions sometimes around our environment are politically motivated rather than based on science and sticking to the true letter of the law.
what are some of those political motivations?
Our politicians want to get elected. And so if there's land clearing, for example, that happens to be in an electorate where they need to win votes, are you going to go in and fine people for breaking the laws at a time when you're wanting to secure their votes?
Right.
Probably not. That could be one reason why it's politically motivated. There are other times that we've seen on the books where the large corporation that's breaking the law essentially could be a financial contributor. They don't want to rock the boats to that, financial contributor to political parties or a mate of a minister, and so on and so forth. So, ministers, I suppose, in a way, they're not really wanting to be seen as laying down the law and being the cop on the street, because they're wanting people to vote for them, and we like to be talking about solutions. But we actually do need someone. We need someone out there to just say, hang on a second, what we've got out there is really precious and we're losing it really fast. We have these laws for a reason. And so if you break the laws, there needs to be penalties. And as soon as we start to see those penalties come, we'll have a new normal, because that's how social norms are created, right?
Right.
It's reward, and we also need to have the carrot and the stick.
The checks and balances. As you were talking before about koalas, I was thinking, what is normal for humans is not necessarily normal for koalas.
And what's normal for humans or for koalas today is going to continue to change with climate change, right? And so that's another really interesting thing. Climate change will force us now to stop relying on normal. The recent bushfires was a bit of a watershed moment for us all in Australia, because we've had scientists warning us bushfire seasons are going to get earlier, they're going to become more frequent, they're going to become more intensified. But we relied on our patterns of normality prior, and we haven't really paid attention to the science in the way that we should have. And all of a sudden, we were facing an abnormal, unprecedented bushfire season. We failed to actually look at the real normal patterns, because scientists were saying the seasons have been getting earlier every year. We've been seeing a build up to this moment. It's really interesting that the impacts of climate change on normality will be something we're going to need to continue to adapt to in coming years, decades.
Because CSIRO scientists have predicted since the 80s, isn't it, that these fires were going to blow out like they did this past year?
Yeah, the government's own climate science research body has on its website, prior to start to be more prepared, and yet we had governments cut fire budgets. And, this is an interesting thing. So I think perceived normal and genuine normal is another really interesting piece, because I think we can sometimes think that last season was like this, and so it's going to be like this again. That's a normal Aussie summer. There's not going to be any such thing as a normal Aussie summer anymore. It will continue to change, and it might not do it like a linear pattern. The science is telling us it's going to continue to go up and down, but we will start to see an increase in natural disasters. That's for sure. It's not just about fires. We'll see more floods. We'll see more just genuine weather patterns that you and I won't recall in our childhood, yet our children will have their childhood marked by them.
Well, absolutely. The attachment that we have to normality, is that our normal everyday lives, the comforts of our normality, does that make us resistant to the messages that we need to change? Does that bolster a sense that we have a right and entitlement to continue doing what we're already doing?
I think comfort is a huge one across so many issues, not just climate change. At the end of the day, as a social species who have a limited time on this planet as individuals, we all want to make sure we have a high quality life and it's a comfortable life. And so we make decisions to try to reinforce and secure that. So we're naturally engineered to be making sure that you and I are comfortable today. We're not necessarily thinking about generations and generations ahead. If we have a decision to make that's going to secure our comfort tomorrow or the next day, we'll make that faster than we will decades ahead. So I think comfort's a big one. I think also the climate debate has gotten us into a sense where we need to take a step back and go, where did we go wrong? How did we allow this to become such a polarizing issue?
Mm,
The science is
yeah.
actually very strong, and the majority of scientists, climate
Mm.
scientists, vast majority, are all in consensus. So I think partly when we make someone feel guilty or ashamed for not believing, we just reinforce their position further, and we haven't genuinely influenced the discussion to get an approach where people feel they can enter it without being judged.
It does feel strange that we're debating about whether or not climate change is real when really, when you look at the data, the debate seems to be how should we tackle that? That seems to be the sensible debate we should be having. How should we tackle climate change rather than is climate change real?
Yeah, and look, I will say, I think even in the last 2 years, the debate has moved there for the majority. Debate, I just call it a discussion, because I think a lot of people have realised we can't continue to debate this. We don't have time anymore. Let's get on with the how now. And certainly, the vast majority of meetings that I'm in that relate to climate change are in the how discussion now. Whereas I would say 3, 4 years ago, you would still preface it by saying to people, assuming climate change is true, you don't have to say that anymore. I don't hear it as much. I think majority have accepted it. It's just now, can we get a new normal in place that's going to get us to the type of action that we need in time?
What are your thoughts about the new normal?
Well, fossil fuels has to be tackled. I mean, just, for starters, I think at the moment, if we look at an Australian context again, because that's always the lens I'm going to use as Chief Conservation Officer of Australia's environmental organisation at WWF, I'm always going to look at an Australian lens. We need to really shift our normal in regards to how we rely on making money for our economy, because we are the second largest exporter of thermal coal in the world.
Mm.
And we have built, an economy and a reliance on jobs that off the back of thermal coal. And so there's a lot of passion for coal. There's a lot of love for it. Our Prime Minister's known for having kissed it in Parliament House. And you can understand that to a certain degree. It has helped secure our prosperity to date. And that's why it's been locked in as our current norm. The challenge I've got is, even if you're not an environmentalist, you just need to look at some of the trends coming up, sneaking up on us, just like the last bushfire. Almost every week, a major bank now is divesting from coal and saying, if you want to create a new coal plant or you want to upgrade your assets, etc., you're not borrowing money from me. I'm not going to be a part of that anymore. There's an enormous trend in the last 18 months for banks to just back out, which means it's going to be super hard soon for those that mine coal to even just borrow money to get the capital to continue doing what they're doing, because their assets will get older. We're also seeing a lot of countries take climate change seriously and starting to try to hit Paris 1.5-degree targets, which means we will start to see natural attrition in the market and people won't want to keep buying our coal in the future.
Mm.
So whether or not it's the environmental motivation or the economic motivation, we need to look at a new normal, because we want to make sure that we continue to be prosperous. Someone, and I hope it's Australia, will work out how to export renewable energy. And that when that day lands, that will become our new normal, and coal will just be pushed to the wayside. And people are working on it now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to interject, but I do see promise when you look at countries like France, who have sold their nuclear power. And yes, it's not renewable, but at least it's in the short term cleaner than coal in the short term. And they've been selling it, I think, at 10 times cheaper than Greece can, to Greece at rates 10 times cheaper than the Greeks can produce it for themselves.
In the last 12 months, we saw renewable energy start to genuinely compete on price with fossil fuels. And so that will start to create a new normal for us. So I've got no doubt that the disruption is happening with or without the environmental motivator. The economic motivator is going to continue to drive it. My main concern is, will we disrupt hard enough and fast enough to secure the future that we want to see? Because all the scientists are telling us there is a window and we need to move hard and fast. And so I just hate to think that we start to invest in the R&D to innovate our way through this one in 5 or 10 years' time. Like, let's do it now.
Yeah,
Let's do it today.
And, Australians have been working on some of the most cost-efficient and energy-efficient solar panels for several decades now.
We invented the solar panel. We invented Wi-Fi. We invented FPOS. We are
and solar panel paint.
we are inventors, and yet the ideology behind coal and it was so entrenched in our day-to-day normality, to the point where the federal government have been able to push a narrative that's just not accurate in trying to sort of pass Australia off as this small player in climate change, when in fact, how can you be considered a small nation in climate change when you are one of the world's largest exporters of thermal coal?
Yeah, when it comes to coal and our non-renewable exports, I think we're pretty much a one-trick economy.
Yeah, and we're starting to see now this worrying narrative around, okay, well, the social license behind coal is starting to get rocky. They're feeling that. How can we shore things up? Like, let's go to gas. Like, it's just the wrong move. It's just the wrong move. Gas is every bit as harmful as coal. So I think it's a really critical year or two ahead in regards to just trying to hold our government leaders to account. And at the moment, we're starting to see movement at the states. We just need to see more movement federally.
Great. Rachel, a way I like to close these interviews, and thank you so much for everything you've shared, and please, if I'm closing it too quickly, let me know.
No, you're fine. And I think you can probably hear my kids in the background because my normal is disrupted at the moment. I've got stage 4 lockdown happening here in Melbourne. So when we talk about, if ever there's been a case study where suddenly you realise that your habits are out of whack and your habitual behaviour needs to change, this is my time.
Well, I'll be quick then. What questions do you think we should be asking about normality, about the new normal, about the way things are currently?
Any questions that start off by getting people to stop and reflect on what it is that we place value on. Which species, which components of our way of life do we want to lock in as our normality for forever? I think are the right questions to ask, because we can't take what's normal today for granted. And what do we need to do to make sure that the things that we love today are still here tomorrow is, I think, a really good question, because I want to make sure that what I've grown up and been able to rely upon as my normal is something that my kids can continue to rely on in the future. And others, not just my own children. But I think that's probably a good question to start with. And then also the other flip side to that question is, what don't we like right now? What are we uncomfortable with? What gives us that feeling, like listen to our gut and just go, that doesn't seem right. That's not the society we want to be. Hang on a second. We are literally the world leaders in the extinction rate for mammals. Like, I've never met an Australian that says, let's lock that norm in.
Yep.
So therefore, the other question I would ask would be, what do we need to do to change that? What new normal do we want to lock in? I think they're the right questions. And the more time and space we can find to ask those questions in a paradigm without judgment, because everyone's going to bring a different lens and everyone does have a different view on, I suppose, whether or not we should heed science and how fast we, listen to scientific expertise, because science has been proven in the past to change based on new findings, etc. And so we've got to allow people to come on the journey, I suppose, in a way that's judgment-free.
I love those two questions. What do we love that we would like to see future generations benefit from or enjoy?
Yeah.
And what don't we love that we need to change?
I think that's probably, if we're going to look at it from a normal lens, I think it seems basic, but I'd love to have more of those discussions, that's for sure.
Great. Rachel Lowry, thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.